Hello and welcome to Forum Stadtpark, to the second event in the lecture series Security Revisited, or Sicherheit Wieder Sprechen in German. The topic of this event is designing climate security, architecture or architectures of the weather. Our guest speakers are Lydia Kallipoliti and Friedrich von Borries. I'm going to introduce them later. At this point, I would just like to thank both of them for accepting my invitation and giving lectures today. My name is Anna Jejnic, and I am head of the section for architecture at Forum Stadtpark. Today I'm going to speak English, mainly because of Lydia Kallipoliti, who lives and works in New York and doesn't speak German. However, the second lecture, the lecture of Friedrich von Borries, is going to be in German. So we are going to combine the two languages, and I hope everything is going to hear and understand everything. As you have probably noticed, this is a hybrid event, so we have part of our audience here physically at Forum Stadtpark. Our speakers are with us via Zoom, and then we also have live stream. So I hope that I'm going to be able to coordinate more or less all these different participants and audiences. I am very pleased and very honored that we have such renowned guests today. Lydia Kallipoliti, who is assistant professor at the Cooper Union in New York, and Friedrich von Borries, professor for design theory at Hamburg University of Fine Arts. They are both very prolific and successful authors whose engagement covers broad range of disciplines and practices, from writing to curating to designing to teaching. I will introduce them more in detail later. At this stage, I just want to thank them once again for being with us. And I also want to thank all of you, both those who are here at Forum and those who are watching us via live stream, for dedicating part of your precious time to this event. I hope that you are going to enjoy it. This event is part of the series Security Revisited, in German Sicherheit Wieder Sprechen, quite difficult to translate in English. Anyway, the series has been conceived and organized jointly by the section for social politics and the section for architecture at Forum Stadtpark. And I'm very glad that Sarah Huber, head of the section for social politics, is also here with us. So Sarah, thanks for coming. And if I forget to say something, please feel free to add whatever you consider important. You can find more information about the lecture series at the website of Forum Stadtpark, also in these printed folders on your seats for here who are at Forum Stadtpark. You can find them not just in Forum Stadtpark, we have distributed them also to several other institutions and places in Graz. So I hope that you're going to catch one of these nicely designed folders. Now, finally, I'm going to say a few words about the topic of today's event. designing climate security about architectures of the weather. Architecture obviously is intrinsically related to both the notion of security as well as to that of the climate. The practice of building has its origins in human struggle to build protection against threats and dangers coming from the outside world, and in the first place from those associated with unfavorable weather conditions. However, this relationship has intensified and changed recently with the advent of the discourse on environmental pollution and more specifically climate change. In this context, the practice of architecture has become more and more a practice of climate making. That is a deliberate construction of more or less isolated micro worlds with their own synthetically produced and maintained climate. Considering that this practice takes place under conditions of neoliberal capitalism, which is characterized by highly asymmetrical, unjust, and exclusive socio-spatial dynamics, the question is how this nexus between architecture, climate making, and provision of security further contributes to these asymmetries and to the reproduction of capitalist ideology, or on the other hand, if there is a possibility to deploy architecture and urban planning for distributing climate risks more equally, and also rethinking and reconceptualizing the very notion of security in the context of the Anthropocene and the related climate change. So these are some of the questions that we are going to address this evening. Our first speaker is Lydia Kallipoliti. Lydia is an architect, engineer, and scholar whose research focuses on the intersections of architecture, technology, and environmental politics. She's currently assistant professor at the Cooper Union in New York. Previously, she taught at several other renowned institutions. Her work has been widely exhibited, including the Venice Biennale, Istanbul Design Biennale, Shenzhen Biennale, the Onassis Cultural Center, and the famous storefront for art and architecture. She's the author of Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit? Lars Muller Publishers 2018, and co-curator of the Tallinn Architecture Biennale 2022 this year. Lydia Kallipoliti's input will take about 20 minutes. After that, I'm going to introduce Friedrich von Borries. His input will also take about 20 minutes. And after that, we will have a discussion, which is only for the part of our audience here physically at Forum Stadtpark. So hello, Lydia, welcome. And I'm very curious about your lecture.
Oh, hi, Anna. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm really excited to join you today. I love the topic and the way that you have framed it. And in many ways, the work that I have been doing over the past decade does in a way address the topic of climate security. I hope to address that today. I'm sorry I don't speak German. I speak Greek, but that doesn't help for today. But in any case, thank you again for the invitation, and I look forward to the conversation with Friedrich. I'm going to share my screen to begin my lecture. So I'm going to start, I tentatively titled my lecture, Bubble Problems and Archaeology of Infection and Environmental Control, thinking through the idea of safety during the pandemic. And in many ways, during the clickbait of the COVID-19 crisis, the icon of the bubble and decontamination protocols have resurged without return. These images that you see on the screen and make you kind of dizzy, house wrecker codes, masks and balloons and mind expanders, Kook Himmelblau's Restless Sphere in Basel, as well as Buckminster Fuller and Soji Sadow's Dome over Manhattan, all very famous projects, have become during the pandemic an ultimate prophylactic space, organizations of containment and engineered safety. In many ways, bubbles are both emblems of climatic control, but also of the hygienic conception of a pure and disinfected atmosphere, one that is regimented and safeguarded for selected human subjects. During the mid-19th century, the goal of improving public health combined with a better understanding of air's thermodynamic properties impelled a persistent interest in building ventilation. At the time, it was generally accepted that human exhalations contained deadly poisons. Foul, or what was called vitiated air, which was issued from one's lungs, was considered the main cause of all human illness, responsible, according to some reports, for 40% of all deaths. In a striking alignment to today's analysis of coronavirus intertransmission and superspreading events, heating and ventilation engineer and self-proclaimed health expert Louis Leeds from Philadelphia argued that man's breath was his own worst enemy. Despite the need for ventilation, nevertheless, Rainer Banham's idiosyncratic fascination with the sealed bubble, which is a very famous architectural prototype that you see on the screen, which was at once a critique, but also a satire and an effort to dismantle the object of enclosure, found refuge in the American ideal of comfort, the authority to control and regulate in an act of ultimate hubris one's atmospheric contents via mechanical ventilation systems. What remains a paradox is the fact that Banham's environmental regime has surfaced as a sustainable design paradigm in controlling the atmosphere and thus saving energy. With blockage from the mechanics of the seasons and the exterior world, and any adversity that such encounter with the outside might entail, buildings saved significant amounts of energy. And it is because of their numerical performance that they have been esteemed as environmentally favorable, reducing thermal loss. In light of this controversial environmental ethic, the protective uterine environment of the bubble has been consistently translated as a conserved ecological milieu, blocked and safeguarded from the effluence of the exterior world. Transmission studies show how with every action like breathing, talking, sneezing, our bodily byproducts offset microecologies that reach every surfaces of the spaces that we occupy. Our encounter with a cloud of dust or the foul air of a passing body might in fact lead to illness, but not all building microecologies are harmful. After all, we ourselves are microbial entities, constellations of bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms. We are receptors of non-human elements and composed of cells that are mostly non-human. In this light, the defensive separation of inside and outside, of shielding in bubbles, cannot become the exclusive protective measure against disease. Interior plant-based phytoremediation, microbial mats used for water filtration, and other microbe-activated filtration media may enable us to coexist with other microorganisms and develop multi-scale and multi-species spaces of interaction. The bubble, the ultimate protective medium against pathogens and illness, cannot save us. It is only an illusion of control that engenders a psychosocial interiority that sets its contents apart from the outside world. A dirtier, more fuzzy reality of multi-species constituents might lead us to a new normality. In conjecturing how the pandemic would reshape architecture, journalist Kyle Chaika wrote in the New Yorker in the summer of 2020 that in the midst of social distancing, the spaces of confinement need not be clean, sanitized, white, and smooth. In their place, he suggested a textured hideaway, like an animal's den, full of reminders that the rest of the world still exists in all its faults, blemishes, and variations. So far, the role of building technology has been to insulate spaces from environmental flows and to create and suggest a moral discipline that protects buildings against disease, transferring an ideological framework of Protestant theology and ethics to the microrealm of materials. Nevertheless, in a new reality of interrelated crises, namely the public health crisis, climate change, and environmental inequality, a new role may be cast to the notion of environment. Instead of it being the inactive, static, and historicized context within which an architectural object is placed, the environment can quite literally become the object of design itself. So these thoughts are reflections from a book that I wrote before the pandemic, which is this one, The Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit? The objective of which was to explore a genealogy of contained microcosms that were built during the 20th century with the ambition to replicate entire sections of the earth in their totality. The book outlined a number of living experiments that forged what I have tentatively called a synthetic naturalism, where the laws of nature and metabolism have been displaced from the domain of wilderness to the domain of cities and buildings. So what would you find in this book? Just to give you very, very briefly a few examples, this is a space capsule from NASA Langley Laboratory in 1960 that enclosed and video monitored 4 men for 4 months inside a steel airlocked hull. The crew remained enclosed until they experienced nausea and infected the system with their shed skin, nails, and hairs. They feared they would swallow their own defecation, and it was one of the first living simulator experiments ever conducted. Another very different example in terms of its political orientation was in 1972. And here you see the Ecological House in London, which was designed by an anarchist group called the Street Farmers, and was described by its neighbors as an eyesore. The house converted shit to food through a series of digesters, while the architect who lived there could never leave the house. The house would get sick if it was not for his management. His own excrement kept the house alive and kept all the systems for growing bananas and tomatoes afloat. Another example that leads to the way that we institutionalize and create policies in the corporate world out of these sustainable living principles is this example in 1994, an office building for university administration that aspired to work in what they said like a flower, but not look like a flower. It was uninspiring as a space and as a building, but it did manifest a checklist of rules that later led to the development of the LEAD program and led to the development of sustainable protocols as a checklist of rules and regulations to create comparative numerical criteria for buildings. And another example in 1928, a hospital that promised to cure patients with respiration problems by sealing them in an airlock and exposing them to abundant oxygen inside a spherical steel shell. Overall, beyond any technical concerns, closed worlds distill architectural concerns related to habitation. First, an integrated structure where humans, their physiology of ingestion and excretion, become combustion devices tied to the system with umbilical cords. At the same time, the intent is to examine ecological questions in a visceral way via the raw ecology of bodies and psyches and their excrement. The book studies recycling not as a statistical problem that we may relate to the management of urban resources, but as a basic bodily reality that affects the water we consume and the air we breathe. As a response today to the question of climate safety and a follow-up to my research on closed roles, I would like to present here a manifesto of 7 points on the power of shit and the idea of closed roles. And point number 1 is that closed roles are in fact power structures that maintain and manage constancy over bodies and psyches. Closed roles are no longer poetic metaphors for lost utopias, like the famous image that you see on the screen. They have become part of everyday life and profitably real. Our indoor environments today are politically charged spaces that reflect social ideals and culturally specific standards of taste and judgment. Confined within artificial enclosures, environmental control has enforced cultural and biased standards of life by recalling the power of data and cultural capital. The establishment of thermal equilibriums in interior spaces since the 1950s sequestered comfort zones that are held between narrow ranges like the ones that you see on the screen, reflects the understanding of a body as a tool within a constant atmospheric medium to control and predict its behavior and growth. It is precisely this mechanical vision of biology that gives life specifically a modern character. If organisms, either these are people or plants, are examined explicitly as mechanical structures, serve a physical equilibrium, one cannot account for the complexity, but neither for the beauty of life. The second point is that the occupant of a closed world becomes its own guinea pig. As Buckminster Fuller suggested, the occupant of a contained environment is also a guinea pig. A guinea pig does not observe and speculate on possible outcomes. Rather, it is willful to insert its bodily parts into the living experiment. The closed world dweller, therefore, is its feeder and caretaker. They monitor it closely and safeguard its operation. Here you see Auguste Piccard, who was a balloonist from a famous family of balloonists from Switzerland and France that reached the stratosphere in the early 20th century in this hermetically sealed aluminum gondola that he designed, almost reaching his death. In this case, you're seeing Russian cosmonaut Evgeny Shepelev, who was one of the first humans to remain in a biosphere, a closed system containing chlorella, which is a type of algae, as the only bioregenerative component that he used to eat and breathe oxygen from. And here you see the anarchist architect Graham Kane from the Eco House that I showed earlier, who drew this diagram and inserted himself as a necessary component of the cyclical operations of interdependencies of resources in the house that he built. So while ecological systems of the post-war period portrayed the inhabitant as an indispensable part of a building ecology, currently this image is a disenfranchised narrative. Environmental concerns promote mostly a conservationist ethic and a list of cautionary daily practices of scarcity. And yet, there is nothing more visceral as a participatory spatial experience than the scientist's voluntary containment inside the premises of a closed world. Point number 3 is that in many ways, closed worlds are a form of hysteria. After years of research on self-reliance, Stuart Brand, who created the whole world, the whole Earth catalog in the 1960s and 70s, confessed that the idea of energy autonomy was a kind of hysteria. Brand's kinship between the closed system and the hysteric body is critical if we reflect on Freud's definition of hysteria as a physiological internal modification of the nervous system. To describe the symptoms of hysteria, Freud spoke of the idea of closure as a type of modification that affects the organism alone instead of one that affects the organism and its surroundings. Point number 4, closed roles prove that waste does not necessarily equal food. This was the premise of this best-selling book in 2002, Cradle to Cradle, which was famous for proposing a circular political economy, arguing for a circular causality in design fields as a means to a diverse, safe, healthy, and equitable world. The problem with this widely circulated premise that popularized the field of sustainable design is that architecture is projected as a neutral field with little disciplinary intelligence of its own. The authors consider design as a ripe field to institutionalize common sense. The idea of a world where all resources could be recirculated and never wasted, although it is very comforting, it defies intricacies that are present both in environmental science as well as in design thinking. Moreover, it dwells on wishful thinking and the idealization of the world as a round field where all resources can be effortlessly regenerated. Closed worlds also do not imply that the earth needs to be held within our hands. We are not its caretakers. Circularity has fostered a perception of earth holding, a progeny of earth photographs held gently and affectionately by human hands, as if the earth is a wounded creature that needs our care. This anthropomorphic perception of the earth as an endangered living species that is cute and sentient, as a being that needs to be petted and protected by us humans, its conquerors, is delusional as it positions us at the center of all pivotal planetary developments. Our perception of the earth as one interconnected world, as an image that promotes unity and unilateral balance, is no longer the case. Unified strategies for divergent problems, in the ideological belief that the metabolism of the planet may become the foundation for technology, culture, and design, is no longer applicable. The whole Earth catalog is no longer whole, or never was whole to begin with. Point 6 is that closed worlds reveal what I call the problem of the arrow. The idealization of circularity reveals a deeply rooted problem of deduction in environmental representation, which is visualized almost exclusively through the use of arrows. Since the 60s, ecologist Howard Odum's energy systems language has instrumentalized ecosystems as well as human agency in terms of input and output. This representational language for ecological simulation models, derivative from electronic circuits, has become the primary tool for architects to visualize performance and energy flow. Although this is very legible, it removes a kind of drawing agency that is critical to our field. Can alternative notation systems and fields effectively replace arrows, given that arrows point only to the end goal of conversions, but say very little about the process of recycling itself? The Chilean biologist Francisco Varela argued that cognitive systems cannot be understood explicitly on the basis of their input and output relationships, but by their operational closure. Thus, the language of environmental representation represents a process of interlinked threads, while these threads and processes are trying to develop relationship within themselves. And final point to close my lecture is that to write a counter history to Cradle and Cradle, one needs to look at shit. Because shit forces us to look at questions of ecology viscerally via the raw ecologies of bodies and the understanding of recycling as not the management and abstract statistics of resources, but as a basic bodily reality. Our unwanted, odorous, and degenerate bodily byproducts have been described as technically powerful and worthy. They can generate methane, meaning power, if treated properly. Then, recycling shit to money is as much a subject of theoretical analysis as a factual constituent of capitalist production. Waste needs to go away, and this very process of purging, transporting, and carrying into oblivion all that is worthless is utterly profitable. Let us not forget that more than a material, shit also indicates a stage of general incoherency, degeneration, and malevolence. It indicates a stage where information is so finely grained and scattered that it cannot be understood as a whole and form identifiable bonds. To write a counter history to optimize circular economies in material conversions, one needs to look at shit. Because only through this raw confrontation may the ecology of life be somehow useful. We need to investigate, monitor, and document the strangeness of the real, to invent an architecture completely devoted to the problems of the real, but not one that is unaware of its uncertainty and complexity. Shit engulfs our existence in more ways than we want to observe and acknowledge. It is not about constructing fictions and fantasies, but about closely observing, monitoring, and conducting forensic analyses, asking questions, and instrumentalizing our findings in creative ways. Possibly shit is our only way out. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much for this super interesting lecture. I have many questions that I would like to ask you, I guess our audience as well, but I would ask everyone to keep their questions for the discussion that will take place after the lecture of Friedrich von Borries, who I'm going to introduce now. Friedrich is an architect, curator, author, and professor for design theory at Hamburg University of Fine Arts. He studied architecture at Berlin University of the Arts, the ISA St. Luc Brussels, and Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, where he received his PhD in 2004. He has curated several major exhibitions, including Updating Germany, that was the German contribution to Venice Biennale of Architecture in 2008, Klimakapseln in 2010, the Design Display exhibition series from 2015 until 2019, and Politics of Design, Design of Politics from 2018 to 2019. He is author of numerous publications, including also several books. I will just manage 3 of them that are maybe of particular relevance for our topic today. So Klimakapseln 2010, RLF 2013, and Weltentwerfen 2016, all of them in Suhrkamp Verlag. Hallo Friedrich, jetzt werde ich versuchen auch wieder Deutsch zu sprechen. Oh, well, that's and better that's for okay for you, because
if you
for
all
us,
excuse
I think
my
everyone...
limited vocabulary, then it's fine. And I think Lydia and I could have a better conversation afterwards when I'm going to speak.
Well, thanks
that
a lot.
English then
Thank you. That's
German.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I really liked your analysis of the errors. And maybe we should cooperate, because for many years I'm collecting artworks of about shit, because I always wanted to make an exhibition on shit. It's such a great topic. So I really liked your last image. I will now try to share my screen as well. And I think this one. Now you see my whole screen, or only the presentation? Now you see more than just the presentation, don't you? Now it's better, isn't it? Okay, so I will speak about climate security on a different perspective than Lydia did, because I always feel uncanny or uncomfortable when I'm confronted with this word climate security, because it mixes up 2 terms coming from a totally different political discourse. Climate, less or more in the recent years, has become a word important, or a term important in a left-wing green ecological discourse, and security still is bound to a conservative or even right-wing discourse. And sometimes I have the sentiment as someone who's placing himself in the left, green, whatever field, being that this term is hijacked less or more by some conservatives. But that maybe as a notation on the side. And I will try to mix up some new thoughts and some older projects which are linked to this term of climate security. And the way in how far I feel uncomfortable with this issue of climate security is represented in a little art piece I made in 2018 called UN Mahak, presented in RMIT in Melbourne. And I imaginated that the United Nations would found a new division called MAHAC, Management and Harvesting of Clouds, which will organize on a global level where clouds are produced and where they're going to be rained. It was inspired on the one hand, as you may all remember, that at the, I think, 2008 Olympics in Beijing, Chinese military managed to avoid rain on sporting grounds with special techniques which were developed in the 50s, where both the US and also the Soviet Union had military programs to use climate as a weapon, or to use the manipulation of climate as a weapon. And in this exhibition, I showed photographies of clouds. As you can see, very beautiful clouds, which we produced with a cane candy machine. Is that the word? Sugar candy? No, sugar cane candy. Where these, give me a second for this word. I think it's cotton candy. Cotton candy. That's the right word. With a cotton candy machine, and the cotton candy machine was also presented in the exhibition, so people had a lot of fun with this horrible topic. And we, one second. We also presented for sure these utensils or the logos, the corporate identity of UN MAHAC in this exhibition. Now this just as a little impression in how far I feel uncanny with this climate security. In the architecture after World War II, compared to the architecture before World War II, much more dystopian ideas came up. I think I will show some images Lydia also have in her background. And the range is coming, or is longing from the dream of climate independence and the dream or the proposals for escape. And as Anna already mentioned, I tried to brought them together in an exhibition and publication called Climate Capsules, Conditions of Survival Within the Catastrophe. I showed a lot of capsular architecture. This is one Lydia also showed in the background, Oasis number 7, by Haus Rucker and Co., an Austrian artist group, which first was presented in '71 in Documenta in Kassel, Documenta 5, and we presented it a few years later. And it's showing the ambivalence of, well, trying to make, like with a palm, a beautiful surrounding, but for sure it's an artificial palm tree and not a real one in this capsule. But I think the most important one, which also was shown by Lydia already, is Dome over Manhattan by Sossi Sadao and Buckminster Fuller in the 1960s. And it's so interesting because it has nothing to do with atomic fear. It was not a proposal against an atomic catastrophe, but it was also not against climate. It was not the topic at that time. They were talking about animals and diseases, so far I remember, small animals, Ungeziefer in German, I don't know the English word for that. And for sure it's a megalomaniac project, but it was meant totally serious. And if you have all these Buckminster Fuller domes in mind, you could imagine that he really believed in constructing that. Well, I think even so, it was not meant to be against atomic war. The background of these kind of projects was always that humans have the capacity to destroy the world, or destroy human conditions for human life on Earth. We can't destroy the world, the Earth. Also, Archigram's Walking City from 1964. Where this idea is that you live in a city, and when you mess up your environment, you can just walk away. Even so, it was, well, pop art and left wing and protest. Still, it's also, from today's perception, an option for adaptation to climate change. You go somewhere, you live there, and then you move away. And in this beautiful collage, you have, skyscraper, urban, dense urbanity in the background, and then you move away if you can't live there anymore, as we know it could happen soon. Interestingly, for me, is another architect, Fritz Haller from Switzerland. I don't know how many of you know him, but he's quite famous for designing this kind of system, and his most successful system is this USM Haller furniture system, which is in a lot of offices. So you know it, but maybe not all of you know that he constructed with the same system based on this idea, also houses, one-family houses, schools, production buildings, and so on. And he also, in 1968, I think, he started to think about extending the system to an urban level, the total city as a global model. So in a way, the megalomania of modernism, as it would have been before World War II, the image or the idea that the architect would plan the whole world and have the perfect model he could scale from the font. He also used a font based on his system to the global urban sphere. And unfortunately, I don't have an image here because I'm on holidays, but he also extended this model to outer space. He started to design what he called Weltraumstädte, outer Earth cities, for 500,000 people flying outside. So in his modernist phantasma to design everything, he was aware that this could destroy the world in a way that we have to leave the world, and that we need outer cities, or cities in outer space. And I think that's so interesting that all these architects after World War II were aware about what they're doing. They were doing it anyway. That's so bizarre from today's perspective. Lydia also showed Biosphere 2 from 1994, a wonderful project. A very rich person financed a program to simulate living conditions on Mars. For sure, it failed. I think ants were a big problem, which invaded his little biosphere. And I like this project so much because many people think that the idea of Mars colonies and living in outer space is something capitalistic, which is not true. It started in the Soviet Union in the 20s, when the theorist of the revolution had to have a problem. The problem was, what could we promise those revolutionary fighters who sacrifice their life to the communist revolution, and they don't get anything because we don't believe in God anymore? Yeah, they have nothing. And so the first step was that the Soviet theoreticians said, okay, we have to overcome death. We have to find a way that we could that we have eternal life, or that we can give people, bring people back to life. And then they realized that if they would manage that, then they would have not enough space on Earth to inhabit all these people. And that was the start in the late 20s of the Soviet Union's space program, when they started to think about, okay, we need science, we need rocket science, we need science how we could live in outer space. It's based in the idea of what is the promise we could give to those people who sacrifice their life for the success of the revolutionary idea of communism. The capitalist idea is a little bit different, but I like to compare them or to have them face to face. So one nice image, isn't it? And they're all in red. Maybe they have none that. The communists also had this idea. So one answer to what we nowadays call climate change or climate catastrophe, or one option, if you think about climate security, is encapsulation and then escape. Because as Lydia already mentioned, encapsulation produces also some serious problems. So we need to expand, we need to escape from Earth. That is one, unfortunately, that is one serious option. And you know that people like Elon Musk are putting a lot of money in that program. And I don't know if we will get to know it or our kids, but it's not that far away that people will live in outer space. It's not rocket science anymore. Another issue which is discussed quite a lot is resilience. In my book, Weltentwerfen, the English title is The World as Projection, I'm trying to find out or to figure out what good design, whatever good means for sure, but what good design is from a political perspective in difference to whatever aesthetic or ecological or whatever the parameters are. And I identified different typologies of design, and one is security design, and one of the reasons I think why Anna invited me. And I came to the conclusion, good design makes it possible to tolerate insecurity. So on all levels of design, if they're dealing with security, one option is to try to produce security, which fails the same way like encapsulated world will fail always. And the other option is to find ways that we learn to tolerate insecurity. And on an urban level, we have a lot of these, a lot of approaches which were described with the term resilient city. So we're looking on, urban planners are looking, and architects, how could we manage climate change? How could we adapt to climate change in a way that the city, the urban space, is becoming more resilient to what we now would describe as an environmental catastrophe. And one example is the Engelhaven Park in Copenhagen by Treaty Nature, one of the biggest and most important climate projects of Copenhagen. And if you look at it, okay, it looks like a park. We could discuss formal issues of it, and it has many elements, whatever from sport, which is important, to trees for production of oxygen and so on. But the point so it is designed that from the perspective of the planners, it stays a beautiful, usable park. An everyday rain event, and a 10 years rain event, and even so in a 100 years rain event. So what we now would describe as a catastrophe, like a 100 years rain event, is part of the planned work as a SWAM to collect the water. So the idea of the resilient city is that everything what we now would describe as a catastrophe, as an environmental catastrophe, too much wind, too much water, too much heat, too much cold, is embedded in our planning so that the city could react on it. And I think this this is quite important, and always when I talk to politicians or to people in kommunaler Verwaltung, local authorities, that's an important point, that what they have to learn. So resilience, if we say climate security, is it's a term, but the idea behind is quite comprehensible, more resilient. Also discussed how we could make that on a social level, but for most local authorities, the technical level is easier to understand and easier to manage. As we all know, how could we design buildings? How could we produce architecture without producing CO2? We all know that the building sector is a big producer, 25 or 30% of the CO2 emissions coming from the building sector. So how to produce CO2? And the big topic nowadays is building with wood. Example from Vienna, close by. Another example from Hamburg, now going to be constructed, Germany's biggest wood tower. And I'm not really convinced about these strategies. You also know that the concrete industry is working on CO2 free or CO2 neutral concrete. Concrete is the production of concrete needs a lot of energy, a lot of heat, a lot of water, and so on. And it's really a dirty way to produce it. And also all these wooden high rises are using concrete still for their construction. And the trick, how these companies were able to say they have CO2 neutral concrete is that they are buying moors. In Scotland, a lot of moors are now bought by companies who are dealing with their capacity to keep CO2 from the atmosphere into the ground. So it's only a play for time that you say, okay, for a few years we can build CO2 neutral because we buy land which we keep as an ecological reserve. It won't last forever. So this idea of CO2 neutrality in architecture, something I don't really believe in. I think Lydia was talking about the same thing with different arguments when she was talking about the self-betrayal of input-output diagrams. So one option would be less is more. So I think if we talk about architecture and climate security, we have to talk about less architecture, less building, and how to avoid to build. In my last book, a novel, Fest der Folgenlosigkeit, prays for inconsequentiality, as maybe the translation. I also are describing an architect who's closing her office and is offering consulting to people who want to build something on how to avoid building. Always when I talk with architects about this, they are not very convinced. I was having once last year a very nice convention with the BDA, the German Chamber of Architects, and I asked them that everyone should bring one building where it's happy that it was not built, because architects have so many unbuilt stuff in their offices. Yeah? And I thought it's easier to bring a project which is unbuilt and they are happy that it's unbuilt than a building which is built and they are unhappy that it was going to build. But even so, nobody presented something. It's so against the mentality of architects to stop to build and to help people to avoid building. For sure, there's some examples who managing to have this change, to work differently. One is Joseph Grimmer, which Lydia will know from New York, I'm sure. He once was the director of storefront, and he now founded a collective non-extractive architecture, so where they're developing strategies for architecture which is not distracting material from the earth. And another example is the collective Rotor DC from Brussels. DC means deconstruction. They are deconstructing buildings, or they're going into buildings which are going to deconstruct, and they're collecting materials which then could be reused in other buildings. They're also offering workshops for students how to deconstruct properly. And maybe that fits also to the shit issue you have. I never understood why every new building needs to have new toilets when in the most deconstructed buildings there's still toilets in the bathrooms which could be reused. Well, so I'm coming to the end, and the question for me is what could be post-anthropocenic strategies of design, of architecture, and I think the conclusion is quite easy. Antoine Logier, one of the early architectural theorist of Enlightenment, he presented in his essays sur l'architecture, essays on architecture in 1755, the so-called first shed, Urhütte, and for sure it was for protection against rain. So the beginning of architecture is to protect humans from environmental influences. And I think what we have to learn, and maybe there I have a little disagreement with Lydia, who in a very nice way spotted the megalomaniac idea of taking care of the earth. But I think if we have to learn to design in a way that it's not human-centered, but it's not about man and mankind and how we feel and what we need and so on. We have to learn, even so we have a problem with agency for sure, in that what are the interests of animals, of other beings nowadays and in other times. So we have to overcome the anthropocentric perspective of architecture and have to learn to design post-anthropocentric. So thank you. I have no idea if these were 20 minutes or less or more, but that's the end of my presentation in English. And I'm also now looking forward for our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Friedrich. I also don't have idea about the time, but since it was so interesting, my impression is that it was not much longer than 20 minutes. Maybe it was even shorter, I really don't know. Just a short notice now for our audience on live stream, because we will close the live stream soon. It is practice here at Forum Stadtpark that the discussion after lectures is just for the audience, the part of the audience which is physically present here. So the information for those who will leave us soon. This is the second lecture. This was the second event in the series. And there will be 6 of them altogether. The next one is going to take place on June 15, always at 7 p.m. That one is dedicated to the topic caring ecology. And the guest speaker will be Alina Brad. Alina Brad is going to be physically present here at Forum Stadtpark. The lecture is going to be in German, and it is going to be moderated by my colleague Sarah Huber. So join us on June 15th again. And now I have to say goodbye to this part of the audience. We will close the live stream now and continue with the discussion.